Ted Bundy, the charming monster. Ted Bundy was one of the most notorious serial killers in history, but what made him particularly terrifying wasn't just the crimes he committed. What truly set Bundy apart was his ability to murder without anyone noticing or even suspecting him. He wasn't an impulsive killer, instead, he was highly intelligent, meticulously calculating every step and detail in each of his crimes. In fact, few people could believe that a handsome, intelligent, and socially well-adapted man could be a serial killer. This is exactly what made Bundy the perfect monster. He understood human psychology deeply and knew precisely how to exploit it for his crimes. He approached his victims in a sophisticated manner. Instead of immediately resorting to violence, he created trust and a sense of security among young women. He would pretend to be injured, perhaps with an arm or leg in a cast, easily gaining sympathy and assistance from kind-hearted girls. Just when his victims felt completely safe and turned their backs, he would strike. What's truly frightening is that these girls typically never suspected the danger they were facing. Bundy knew exactly how to ensure that no one around him would suspect him as the perpetrator. He studied psychology and even worked at an anti-crime organization. These connections, combined with his charming appearance and charismatic personality, allowed him to effortlessly conceal his true nature. He wasn't some stranger suddenly appearing out of nowhere. He was someone you trusted, someone you could comfortably talk to without any fear. This is precisely what made him more dangerous than ever. Ted Bundy, the perfect monster. Ted Bundy was not the kind of man you would think of as a murderer. He didn't have the wild, unpredictable behavior you might expect from a killer. No, Bundy was smooth, composed, and remarkably charming. At first glance, he looked like someone you'd invite into your life, the kind of person who could easily blend into any social gathering. He was tall, with a square jaw, and a perfect smile, someone who you'd think of as a friend rather than a threat. But behind that handsome face was something much darker, something that made him a predator hiding in plain sight. What made Bundy so terrifying wasn't just his appearance, but his ability to manipulate people. He was incredibly intelligent and understood human nature in ways most people couldn't. Ted Bundy studied his victims, learned their behaviors, and then used that knowledge to exploit their trust. He wasn't just attacking at random. He was methodical, calculating each move with precision, like a predator stalking its prey. Imagine this: you're walking alone on a college campus. It's late afternoon, and the campus is quiet, almost peaceful. Then, out of nowhere, a man approaches you. He looks like a typical student dressed neatly, with an air of confidence. But as he gets closer, you notice something strange. His arm is in a cast, or perhaps he's limping slightly, as though he's injured. He asks for your help. Maybe he needs assistance carrying a heavy stack of books or even getting to his car. He seems harmless, right? Maybe you feel bad for him, maybe you feel sorry for his injury, and without a second thought, you offer to help. Now, imagine you're that woman, helping a stranger with his books. It's a simple act of kindness. You might feel proud of yourself for helping someone in need, but you don't realize that by offering your assistance, you've just entered the trap that Ted Bundy so carefully set for his victims. While you're distracted, trying to help this harmless man, he strikes. He's already thinking 2 or 3 steps ahead. His plan wasn't to just attack immediately, no, he used the time you spent talking to him, gaining your trust, to lower your guard. What makes this even more chilling is how Bundy used his charm to disarm his victims. His smooth talking, good looks, and approachable demeanor made him appear completely trustworthy. Unlike most killers who operate in secrecy, Ted Bundy was out in the open, never giving off any warning signs. That's the dangerous part. He didn't need to hide his true nature. He was able to manipulate people into feeling completely safe around him. To Bundy, the act of gaining his victims' trust was not an obstacle, it was part of his strategy. His victims, often young women, didn't see him as a threat. He was a man who looked and acted just like the kind of person you'd see walking around any campus, any city, anyone's neighborhood. That sense of normalcy, of comfort, is what allowed him to get so close to his victims without raising any suspicion. He made them believe that they were helping someone who needed help. But in reality, he was in control from the very beginning. Ted Bundy wasn't just a killer, he was a psychopath with a deep understanding of human psychology. Psychopathy is often associated with a lack of empathy and an inability to connect with the emotions of others. But Bundy's case was different. While he may not have felt empathy in the way that others do, he had a unique skill set. He was able to understand other people's emotions so well that he could manipulate them to his advantage. He could pretend to be the charming, well-meaning young man, the kind of person you would want to help. He would play the role of a victim. He would fake an injury or act helpless, prompting the natural kindness in others to come forward. But what his victims didn't realize was that he was setting them up for their last moments on earth. It was a game to him. He used their compassion, their goodness, against them. Unlike other killers who might act impulsively, Bundy took his time. He didn't just pick a victim on a whim. He studied his targets, learned their habits, and knew exactly when and how to strike. He would often follow them, watch them, learn their routines. He knew that many of his victims would be vulnerable alone on campuses, walking in secluded areas, far enough from help. And it was precisely in these moments that he would pounce. But it wasn't just about the physical act of killing. Bundy found satisfaction in controlling the situation. His ability to make people feel safe just before he attacked was his greatest weapon. He wasn't just taking lives, he was manipulating the very fabric of trust, twisting it until it became the very thing that led to his victim's demise. Ted Bundy wasn't a mindless killer. He was incredibly intelligent. He studied psychology, he worked in law, and he even became a part of the law enforcement system in some way, working with organizations dedicated to fighting crime. This gave him insight into how police investigated and tracked criminals. He knew how to stay ahead of the law, how to avoid capture, and how to blend in when necessary. Ted Bundy's victims. Ted Bundy's victims were often young, beautiful women, most of them in their late teens or early 20s. They were innocent and trusting, much like any young woman would be in a world where kindness is expected in return for kindness. Ted Bundy was acutely aware of this vulnerability, and he exploited it with terrifying precision. His victims were not random. They were chosen carefully, deliberately, and methodically. Bundy didn't target any person who crossed his path. No, his choice was always intentional, his victims often representing the ideal targets in his twisted mind. He knew that these young women, often walking alone or in secluded areas, would be more willing to help someone in need. They were raised to be kind and compassionate, to help when asked. Bundy used this social expectation against them. His tactics were simple, yet effective. He would approach them with a soft, pleading request for help. Perhaps his arm was in a cast, or he appeared to be struggling with a heavy load of books. These were common tactics to make his victim feel empathy, and that empathy would be their downfall. Imagine you are walking across your college campus, or down a quiet street, when you encounter a man who appears to be hurt. His arm is in a cast, he's struggling to carry something, maybe it's a heavy bag or a stack of books. He looks helpless, vulnerable, and as a kind-hearted person, you instinctively want to help. It's not unusual to stop and offer assistance. After all, you've been taught since childhood that kindness to strangers is important. But in this moment, you would have no idea that you've just placed your trust in a master manipulator, a predator in disguise. Bundy, however, was not a random stranger. He was calculating. He knew exactly how to appear weak or injured, just enough to lower his victim's defenses. And that was the key, he didn't immediately attack. Instead, he would play the role of a victim, drawing out the empathy of the women he approached. He made them feel like they were helping someone who needed it, someone who wasn't capable of hurting them. They felt safe. They felt like they were doing a good deed. This was the trap, he said. Ted Bundy didn't rush. He wasn't driven by the reckless urgency of a madman. No, he was cold, patient, and planned every step. Once his victim had lowered her guard after offering to help him with something, after being close enough to interact with him, that's when Bundy struck. He knew the perfect moment. This is what made him so dangerous. He didn't take risks. Every move was calculated, every interaction carefully orchestrated to guarantee that the victim would be at her most vulnerable. Ted Bundy didn't just act on impulse like many other killers. He studied his victims. He knew where they were likely to be alone, where they would be most trusting, and at what time of day or night they would be most vulnerable. Many of his victims were college students, young women out walking by themselves in areas that felt familiar and safe to them. He would stalk his victims, learning their schedules, figuring out where they would be at specific times. He would often follow them from a distance, watching them, waiting for the right moment to make his move. Sometimes, he would even revisit the same locations over and over again, observing his victims' behavior, getting a feel for their routines. His attacks were not spontaneous, they were carefully planned. And the women he targeted were chosen because they fit a particular type: young, beautiful, trusting, and, perhaps most importantly, in situations where they could easily be manipulated into helping him. What made Ted Bundy's attacks even more disturbing was his ability to manipulate not just his victims, but the people around him. His charm was so convincing that even after his victims had been taken, those around them had a hard time believing that someone like Bundy could be capable of such atrocities. He knew how to appear harmless, even endearing. His calm, collected demeanor made him appear trustworthy, even likable. As Bundy interacted with his victims, he would use their empathy to his advantage, making them feel as though they were helping someone who was genuinely in need. He wasn't a big, aggressive figure. He didn't shout or force his way onto anyone. He simply blended in, used his looks, his mannerisms, and his intelligence to convince them that he was a safe person to trust. In this way, Bundy played on the innocence of his victims, preying on their good intentions to help someone they thought was just another person like them. And that trust he built was the final piece of his carefully orchestrated plan. Bundy's attacks were brutal, but the real horror lay in how he made his victims feel before he took their lives. He had the ability to get close, to make his victims feel that they were helping someone who would never harm them. And then, when their guard was completely down, he would strike. It wasn't just the physical violence that made Bundy so terrifying, it was the emotional manipulation that preceded it. His victims were made to feel like they were simply doing a good deed, like they were safe, even as he slowly closed in on them. What is perhaps most disturbing about Bundy's victims is the fact that they were often the kindest, most trusting of people. They were not careless or naive, they simply believed that people are inherently good, as they were taught to do. This belief that kindness would be returned was what made Bundy's actions even more appalling. He was not just taking lives, he was stealing the trust and security that these young women had always taken for granted. And it was this betrayal of trust that made his crimes so horrific. As we dive deeper into Ted Bundy's crimes, it's essential to consider not just the physical horror of his attacks, but the emotional and psychological toll they took on his victims and their families. For the victims, it wasn't just the brutal act of violence that destroyed them, it was the violation of their safety, the betrayal of their instincts to trust. And for their families, the pain of losing someone they loved was compounded by the fact that these young women had been deceived by a master manipulator. Bundy didn't just kill his victims, he shattered the world of those who loved them. He made every trust they ever had seem dangerous, and that kind of fear echoes long after the crime. Ted Bundy's victims were not just statistics. They were young women with dreams, hopes, and futures that were stolen from them by a man who understood the power of manipulation and charm. He didn't need brute force or violence to gain control. He simply needed to prey on their kindness, to exploit their natural empathy for someone who seemed harmless. This is what makes Ted Bundy not just a killer, but a master manipulator of the human mind. Bundy's escape and the police's struggle. Ted Bundy wasn't just a ruthless killer, he was a master of evasion, always staying one step ahead of law enforcement. His ability to disappear after each crime made him an incredibly difficult target for the police. For years, Bundy eluded capture, slipping through the cracks in the system like a ghost. He understood the importance of staying out of sight, and he was remarkably skilled at hiding in plain sight. While the police were desperately trying to connect the dots, Bundy was already planning his next move, always ahead of the game. One of the most unsettling aspects of Bundy's evasion was how he would slip away after each attack. Imagine for a moment the scene: a brutal murder occurs, and the police are quick to respond. They collect evidence, interview witnesses, and search for clues. But Bundy was never where they expected him to be. He could blend into any crowd, hide in plain sight, and just disappear. His ability to stay undetected for so long was chilling, and it was this ability that allowed him to keep killing without fear of being caught. As if escaping from the police wasn't enough, Bundy also managed to escape from prison twice. Both escapes demonstrated just how far he was willing to go to maintain his freedom. The first time was in 1977, when Bundy was being held in a Colorado prison. His escape was simple, yet daring. One night, Bundy climbed into a hole he had cut in the ceiling of his cell, and then he crawled through the attic spaces of the building, eventually making his way out. It was a clever escape, showing his resourcefulness, but what was more terrifying was how easily he managed to do it. The prison was supposed to be a high-security facility, but Bundy found a way out with just a little bit of ingenuity. But his first escape was just a warm-up for what was to come. A few months later, Bundy was arrested again, but by then, the police had no idea how cunning and dangerous he really was. They thought they had contained him, but they were wrong. In 1977, while he was awaiting trial for a string of murders, Bundy managed to escape a second time. This time, his method was even more disturbing. He used a hacksaw to carve a hole through the floor of his cell, making his way through a series of tunnels and ducts to freedom. Once again, he walked out of the prison, this time disguised as a visitor, blending into the background just long enough to slip past the guards. What makes this escape even more terrifying is how Bundy's charm and manipulative nature played into his ability to evade capture. When he escaped the second time, he didn't just vanish into the wilderness. He knew how to blend into society. He could walk down the streets of any city and be just another face in the crowd. No one would suspect him. Bundy had learned how to read people, how to understand their behaviors, and how to appear completely harmless. This ability to deceive made him even more dangerous. He wasn't just hiding from the police, he was hiding in plain sight, appearing to be a regular man who had nothing to fear. For the police, it was a maddening game of cat and mouse. Even when they thought they had him cornered, Bundy would slip away, always a step ahead. Despite the police's best efforts, Bundy was still able to outsmart them. The authorities had some basic details about the suspect: a man who was tall, had dark hair, and drove a distinctive yellow Volkswagen Beetle. They even had a police sketch based on witness descriptions. Yet, despite this, the police struggled to make the connection. They were investigating multiple cases, with victims in different cities, and they couldn't quite piece it all together. And Bundy's ability to appear normal, even likable, played a huge role in the delay of his capture. He wasn't the kind of man who looked like a dangerous criminal. His charm and his ability to manipulate people into thinking he was harmless only delayed the investigation. Even when a woman who worked with Bundy at a local office noticed the striking similarities between the police sketch and Bundy himself, the police did not immediately act on the information. They dismissed it as a coincidence. It wasn't until a breakthrough came later, when Bundy's previous actions began to align with new evidence, that they finally started to connect the dots. But Bundy's escapes weren't the only challenge the police faced. Even after his second escape, Bundy didn't stop killing. He continued to abduct, brutalize, and murder young women, this time in the state of Florida. His need for control, his thirst for violence, and his utter lack of empathy drove him to commit even more heinous crimes during his time on the run. The authorities were now dealing with a man who was not only evading their capture but was also actively engaging in more horrific acts. His confidence grew with each day he remained free, and he showed no remorse for his actions. At the same time, law enforcement officials were desperately trying to track him down. But Bundy was always careful, always thinking several steps ahead. He had learned the tricks of the trade: how to avoid detection, how to cover his tracks, and how to disappear again and again. The police were becoming increasingly frustrated. Every lead they followed turned out to be a dead end. Bundy had turned the game into a twisted, psychological challenge, and for the longest time, the police were losing. It wasn't until a routine traffic stop in 1978 that Bundy's luck finally ran out. A police officer, noticing Bundy's suspicious behavior and knowing that he was a suspect in a series of crimes, decided to pull him over. In the car, they found the tools of his trade: cuffs, a mask, ropes, and other items that left no doubt in the officer's mind that Bundy was the man they had been hunting. For once, Ted Bundy was caught off guard. After years of evading the law, Ted Bundy was finally back in custody. The police had spent years trying to capture him, and despite the many opportunities he had to escape, they were now certain that they had him. Bundy was no longer the ghost he once was, and he would face the consequences of his brutal actions. But for the police and the public, Bundy's capture felt like a bittersweet victory. While they had finally stopped him, the damage he caused had already been done. Ted Bundy wasn't just a killer, he was a master manipulator who used his intelligence to stay ahead of the police and evade capture for years. His ability to escape twice from prison and continue his killing spree afterward showed just how dangerous he was. The police struggled to catch him, even with detailed descriptions, witness accounts, and evidence pointing to him. It took years for them to finally piece together the truth, and in the end, his charm and psychological tactics had prolonged his reign of terror. The man behind the mask. What made Ted Bundy so chilling wasn't just the brutal actions he committed, but the fact that he could blend into society so effortlessly. He wasn't some out-of-place monster lurking in the shadows. No, Ted Bundy looked just like anyone else. He had the appearance of a normal, everyday man. His tall, athletic frame, his clean-cut appearance, and his charming smile made him someone people would gravitate towards, someone you wouldn't hesitate to trust. But that's what made him so terrifying, because he wasn't just a killer in the traditional sense. He was a man who could walk into a room and make people feel comfortable, make them feel safe, when in reality, he was the one person they should fear the most. Ted Bundy was well-spoken, educated, and had a magnetic charisma that drew people in. He didn't speak in an erratic, unsettling way like many criminals. Instead, he spoke clearly and confidently, often displaying knowledge and wit that impressed those around him. He had the kind of presence that made him seem trustworthy, approachable, even likable. People would look at him and see someone who was friendly, maybe even charming. There was nothing about his demeanor that screamed danger. For many, Bundy seemed like someone who could easily be trusted, the type of person you would invite into your home without hesitation. Bundy knew exactly how to use his charm and intelligence to his advantage. He worked in several positions where he had access to sensitive information, particularly information related to law enforcement and criminal investigations. One of his jobs involved helping with missing person cases, a role where he was able to observe how investigations were handled. He knew exactly how police worked, what kinds of evidence they focused on, and how they tracked down suspects. Bundy used this inside knowledge to evade capture time and time again. He didn't just escape from the police physically, he also outsmarted them mentally. In fact, Bundy was so well integrated into society that many people who were close to him, including some who worked with him, never suspected him to be the monster he truly was. Think about that for a moment. He was working alongside police officers, talking to investigators, and yet, no one ever suspected him of being the very person they were looking for. To the people around him, Ted Bundy was a colleague, a friend, maybe even a confidant. His ability to hide his true nature behind a mask of normalcy is what made him such a dangerous figure. He didn't draw attention to himself. He was a master of appearing just like everyone else, while secretly being a killer who could take the lives of innocent women without a second thought. One of the most chilling things about Bundy was how he managed his relationships. He could make people believe in him, even after everything he had done. He had an ability to weave a web of lies so convincing that no one could see through it. He was a master manipulator, using his charm to deflect suspicion and convince those around him that he was harmless. When friends or acquaintances would ask about his past, Bundy knew how to deflect. He would be vague, mysterious, or offer just enough detail to make himself seem like a man of integrity. He didn't appear as a liar or a manipulator, he appeared as someone who was just like everyone else. When Bundy was eventually arrested, even then, people couldn't fathom the true horror of what he had done. His trial became a spectacle televised, followed by millions. And even there, Ted Bundy continued to manipulate the public. During the trial, he represented himself, using his intelligence and charm to speak directly to the jury, all while maintaining the persona of a man who simply made some mistakes. He used his looks, his words, and his calculated behavior to sway those around him. In fact, some of the women who had been following the case even became infatuated with him. They saw him as misunderstood, as someone who could be redeemed, someone who didn't fit the mold of the monster they thought he was. They saw the mask, the well-groomed, charismatic, charming man, and not the killer behind it. Think about how Bundy was able to manipulate his victims. It wasn't just about physical violence, it was about how he used psychological manipulation to disarm them. He would approach his victims with such calculated charm, often pretending to be injured or helpless, and then use that vulnerability to gain their trust. He wasn't some wild-eyed lunatic, he was a man who understood how to work with people, how to read them, and how to exploit their trust. His victims never suspected a thing until it was too late. They didn't see him as dangerous, they saw him as a man in need of help. Bundy knew how to make his victims feel sorry for him, to see him as someone who could not possibly be a killer. And that's what made him such a horrifying presence. He wasn't an obvious threat, but a carefully crafted illusion of normality. Bundy's charm was a double-edged sword. It was the weapon that made him so effective at manipulating not just his victims, but the people around him as well. To the outside world, he was a polished, educated, and well-spoken man who had a future ahead of him. He had all the traits that society typically associates with success: good looks, charm, intelligence, and a calm demeanor. Yet underneath all of that, Bundy harbored a dark, twisted nature that only a few people, if any, would ever see. This juxtaposition between the charming, intelligent man and the brutal killer was what made Bundy's crimes so terrifying. He wasn't just hiding behind a mask. He was living the mask, and it was a mask that fooled nearly everyone who encountered him. Ted Bundy's ability to manipulate was not just limited to the people he interacted with directly. He also manipulated the criminal justice system. His ability to speak eloquently, to present himself in a way that seemed rational and even sympathetic, made him a difficult person for law enforcement to pin down. He was a predator who understood the psychology of law enforcement, who knew how to keep his distance, how to present a false image, and how to keep the authorities from ever suspecting him for the crimes he was committing. Bundy's true horror wasn't just in his actions, but in the fact that he could wear the mask of normalcy so effortlessly. He could walk into any room and blend in with those around him, leaving no sign of the monster hiding underneath. That ability to deceive, to manipulate, and to appear harmless made him one of the most terrifying killers in history. Ted Bundy wasn't just a monster in the traditional sense. He was a monster who wore the face of someone you could trust. The trial and final days. Ted Bundy's trial marked a pivotal moment in American criminal justice. It was the first time a trial of such magnitude was broadcast live on television, bringing the details of his heinous crimes into homes across the country. The trial became a spectacle, not just because of the gruesome nature of his crimes, but also because of the way Bundy conducted himself. He wasn't just a defendant, he was a showman, a master manipulator, and this was his stage. He understood the power of the media, and he used it to his advantage, all while pretending to be a man wronged by the system. Bundy, knowing full well how persuasive he could be, made the shocking decision to represent himself in court. His belief that his charm and intelligence could sway the jury was evident in his choice to act as his own lawyer. He wasn't just there to defend himself, he saw this trial as an opportunity to charm the public, to manipulate everyone in the courtroom, and to prove that he could escape conviction through sheer force of will. Bundy's decision was a clear reflection of his narcissism and belief that he was above the law, that he could talk his way out of anything, just as he had done so many times before with his victims and even law enforcement. He appeared confident in the courtroom, his words smooth and calculated, attempting to convince the jury that he was innocent. Bundy's well-spoken, calm demeanor was a sharp contrast to the evidence against him. But what he didn't understand, or perhaps what he failed to admit, was that his charm no longer had the same power over the people who were tasked with judging him. The overwhelming evidence, the testimony of countless victims, and his own manipulative behavior in the court itself started to erode any semblance of doubt about his guilt. Throughout the trial, Bundy would often appear in front of the jury, speaking with a mixture of arrogance and confidence. He was calm under pressure, always thinking several steps ahead, just as he had done during his murders. However, his decision to represent himself began to backfire as the case against him grew stronger. As Bundy tried to convince the jury of his innocence, the evidence piled up, and his manipulative tactics were no longer enough to cloud the truth. The trial was an emotional roller coaster for the victims' families. They had to sit through days of Bundy's self-serving defense, watching the man who had taken their loved ones' lives attempt to charm his way out of the punishment he so rightly deserved. Bundy's use of the media, his calculated arguments, and his ability to keep his composure throughout the process, were a final reminder of the manipulative hold he had over people, even in the most dire of situations. Despite Bundy's best efforts to present himself as a man wronged by the justice system, the facts were undeniable. The evidence against him was overwhelming. There were eyewitness accounts, forensic evidence, and the physical links that connected Bundy to the murders. His presence at crime scenes, the detailed descriptions of him from survivors, the items found in his possession, and the testimony of the women who survived his attacks, it was all there. What was truly chilling was how Bundy tried to downplay the brutality of his actions. He couldn't even admit his own guilt, choosing instead to maintain the persona of a man who was being wrongly accused. But even his most persuasive arguments couldn't sway the jury. The facts spoke for themselves. Bundy was convicted of numerous murders, and the public finally saw him for what he truly was: a cold, calculating killer who used his charm and intelligence to manipulate and destroy. On the 24th of July, 1979, Ted Bundy was sentenced to death by electric chair. The courtroom fell silent as the sentence was read. For many, it was a moment of justice, a moment of closure for the families who had lost their loved ones to Bundy's crimes. But it was also a reflection of the horror that Bundy had caused, the pain he had inflicted on so many innocent lives. Even after his conviction, Bundy continued to fight, appealing his sentence and claiming his innocence, even as more and more evidence came to light. He didn't seem to fully grasp the gravity of what he had done. Instead, he continued to manipulate the situation, trying to prolong his life and avoid the consequences of his actions. but his appeals were rejected, and he was moved to Florida State Prison, where he would spend his final days. During his time in prison, Ted Bundy's manipulative abilities didn't disappear. In fact, they only grew stronger. While incarcerated, Bundy continued to charm and manipulate those around him, including the guards, the staff, and even the women who visited him. It was during this time that Bundy fathered a child with one of his girlfriends, demonstrating just how far his manipulative abilities stretched, even behind bars. He was still able to charm people, still able to convince them that he was something other than the monster he truly was. In his final years, Bundy would occasionally offer vague confessions about the details of his crimes. But even then, he was calculating. He didn't express remorse, nor did he fully confess to the full extent of his crimes. His confessions were more about trying to delay his execution than about truly coming clean. Bundy's lack of remorse, even in the face of his impending death, showed just how far removed he was from the reality of his actions. Finally, on January 24, 1989, Ted Bundy was executed by electric chair at Florida State Prison. After years of terror, manipulation, and deceit, the man who had killed more than 30 women was brought to justice. But for the families of his victims, the pain never truly ended. The closure that came with Bundy's execution couldn't bring back the lives he had taken or erase the horror he had caused. Bundy's final days were marked by an unsettling calm. He showed little emotion as the day of his execution drew near, and in his final moments, he still tried to maintain his image as someone who was misunderstood. Some reports say that in his last words, Bundy expressed regret, but not for his actions, rather, for the harm he had caused to those who were close to him. He died, as he had lived, with a carefully crafted mask, hiding the true monster inside. Ted Bundy's trial, his conviction, and his final days were a culmination of a years-long manhunt and a life of manipulation. His charm and intelligence were what made him a dangerous predator, and his ability to hide his true nature behind a mask of normalcy allowed him to terrorize a nation. Even in the end, Bundy's refusal to admit fully to his crimes, and his desire to manipulate even those closest to him, showed the extent to which he was still the same killer he had always been. His execution was a tragic end to a horrific story, but it was also a reminder of the terrible cost of his manipulations and the countless lives he destroyed along the way. His story forces us to rethink the idea of safety and trust, and it underscores the importance of remaining vigilant, even when everything seems normal. Bundy showed us that monsters don't always wear the typical signs of danger. Sometimes, they blend in perfectly, and it's only when it's too late that we realize the monster was never far from us. The legacy of Ted Bundy is not just the story of a man who committed heinous acts, it is a reminder that the world is full of people who can manipulate, deceive, and harm without ever showing their true selves. It is a legacy that continues to haunt not just the families of his victims, but society as a whole. Bundy's legacy will forever serve as a reminder of how darkness can lurk beneath the surface of even the most seemingly ordinary people.